Hello, and welcome to another World of UX podcast. This is your host, Darren Hood. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time to join us on today. Special welcome. Those of you, hey, listening for the first time, welcome. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in to the show. Today, we're going to have a bit of a segue in that we just finished a 2-week session where I was talking about unrealistic expectations that some people have in UX today. And we're piggyback on it just a tad, but as many of our segues are, they are UX Potpourri sessions. So here we are with another UX Potpourri session, and we're going to be talking about some different things. Again, some things that happen on social media. It'll sound a little bit like last week and the week before that. And I did mention that was like a potpourri. This is definitely a potpourri segment on today, where I'm going to be talking about 4 topics that came to mind over the course of the last week, some based on interactions that I've had with people. You could almost think of these as some unrealistic expectations, but they're not really. They're just some random topics. That's what potpourri is for those of you that are new to the show. Random topics that come up for whatever the reason might be. And it just struck me that it would be good to share these. It would help someone, help a lot of people, actually, and bring some things to light. A lot of times, a lot of people in UX are just, especially newer people, nothing against newer people, just, hey, calling it like it is. A lot of newer people come in, they want to get the jobs, they're excited, and they don't understand. You come into something and there's just a bunch of stuff that's in place. A lot of good, of course. The discipline is fantastic. A lot of things that are good, a lot of things that are challenging, a lot of things that people need to be on the lookout for because they're pitfalls and potholes. And people are not aware of those things. And it may not feel great to hear about these things. It could be a little bit, some people might call it a Debbie Downer thing. Some people will say that. No, it's called realism. And ironically, UX is a field that thrives on realism. The work that we do thrives on realism. So when people are operating in UX, and they're sticking their head in the sand, so to speak, ostrich effect bias, and don't want to hear about the realism-oriented factors. A lot of people that have been around for a while don't like the fact that I talk about all of these realism-oriented factors when these things are so real. If you don't embrace them, if you don't look at them, if you don't consider them, they are going to bite you. It is a matter of time before the things that we talk about like this, you're going to come face to face with them. And if you're not aware of them, if you're not ready to deal with them, if you haven't at least considered it, then what you're going to experience because you come into contact with these things could be very devastating, way more frustrating than just hearing about it, because now you hear about it, you haven't had a chance to think about it. You haven't had a chance to think about what you might do since you come in contact with these things. So realism is good. It's healthy. It's considerate. It's respectful to share things. I was in a conversation with someone at a meetup recently, and someone was saying something, they were sharing something very realism oriented, and they apologized. And I told them on the spot, do not apologize for telling people what they need to know. You're being respectful when you do that, folks. You're being helpful when you do that. You might lose a few friends and a few supporters along the way, but they'll be back. I have talked to so many people who say, when you said that, it bothered me. And the next thing you know, I'm looking at it and, oh my God, everything you say, it is relevant. There, a lot of people have said this. And the people who don't, we're going to talk about some of them today. The people who don't, they have another agenda. They just don't want to deal with certain things. And, it is what it is. But these things are real. These things are relevant. These things are things that matter. They're things that people need to be aware of. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm not going to use a sound effect today. I'm just going to jump from topic to topic, but let's jump into all 4 of these right away. Topic number 1 today. One of the things, I talked about this recently, but I'm going to talk about it from a different angle and share something I've never shared before. I don't believe I have. Remember, we talk a lot about generalists versus specialists. And by way of quick recap, I've talked before about how that pretty much everybody, if not everybody, I've met a couple of people who were specialists in UX prior to 2011, but for the vast majority of us, we were generalists. If you were in UX prior to 2011, even the people that were specialists, actually, you weren't going to get into UX without learning about everything back then. So even if you had some people that were just doing research or just doing design or whatever, they still understood the other disciplines, because when you got into it, most of us that got into UX early on fell into it. We didn't make a decision to get into it. We fell into it. And so there weren't that many books on the market, and you would read something and you would check out everything. You would learn about information architecture. You would learn about research. You would learn about usability. These were the books that dominated the market at that time. I think about Nathan Shedroff. My memory serves me correctly. His book that came out prior to 2000 about experience design, that's the name of the book, Experience Design. It was a very holistic book. So you looked at everything. This is what we did. So you were a generalist, as we call them now. They didn't even call us generalists back then because there was nothing to differentiate, no reason, I should say, to differentiate one UX practitioner for another one, because every time you met somebody, we did all the things. That's the way it was. Come 2011, and somebody got the great idea that there should be specialists, and they started creating these specialist roles, not knowing that they were really creating an issue that was going to later come back to bite us, in that means that now, instead of having a person that focus on everything from information architecture to usability to research to interaction to interface design, you had people that were doing each one of these as a specialization. Well, now instead of one salary, you had, and teams that were distributed properly with a proper number of people on the teams, now you've got 5 people instead of 1. And now you have this disproportionate number of people on the team. That means there's a disproportionate number of checks, which eventually means that the overhead is off the charts. And eventually that's what came back to bite us, because a lot of teams had to lay people off because the head count was too great. So this is a problem that UXers created that came from people not understanding UX, not knowing its history, running the teams. They were the ones making these decisions and coming up with this phenomenal idea, if you will, that we needed all these specialists. So that's just a historical perspective. What I want to address today is the fact that and there's a realism perspective thinking about the last 2 weeks associated with this. So, but the whole mindset of, people will go through a boot camp, say, this will help set the stage for this. People are just getting whatever. They're learning about UX whatsoever. They want to get involved. And a lot of people were told, you know what? Why don't you just freelance? Why don't you just do some consulting? Now, this was coming up at the same time that becoming a specialist was popular. Here's what I want to address. The user-centered design consulting market was already set with generalists. That mode of operation had already been set. You didn't become a consultant and you were a specialist. You were a consultant because you could do everything. You could address research. You could address design. You could address everything that was under the umbrella of UX or user-centered design. If you needed somebody to bring in somebody possibly that was a specialist, that's on you. That's going to vary from job to job. So we're not even going to talk about that, because that's going to be a variance factor. But please know and understand, if you were a freelancer, even if you're a freelancer today, you have to be a generalist, because you have to be able to do or consult on everything, not just something that a specialist would do. If you're going to be a consultant, still to this day, you have to be a generalist. You cannot be a specialist and then turn around and say that you're going to be a freelancer or a consultant. Specialists who lack acumen in one area or another simply will not be able to function ethically and will not be able to function properly as a freelancer or a generalist. So please keep that in mind today, just to show you how things have gone askew. Because everybody, I'm going to be a freelancer. I'm going to do some consulting. Well, then you need to learn everything about UX, because you are the person, when you're a consultant, when you're a freelancer, you have to have all of the answers. So you cannot be a specialist. You cannot just go into research. You can be a research consultant, But you can be a research freelancer, but you can't be a freelancer in general. You have to know everything. Make sure I clarify that. Somebody's going to, you didn't say, you know what I'm saying. You get it. So that's it. Let's move on to number two. Topic number two today. I came across a post, and this really stirred me up when I saw this. And I'm not going to get into the weeds about this. I'm going to go pretty quickly across these four today. But I saw a post where it was funny, a person just was talking about how you set up, how you build a UX team in-house. And they had some generally good tips in their list. And I don't want to present the list. I don't want to identify the person. But if you come across anything like this, please read it with a grain of salt. Take what they say, I should say, with a grain of salt. Because the person was saying that you need to do these 5, 6, 7, 8 things in order to build a UX team in-house. But they were missing something that's key. Something I've talked about on this program before is that they never once recommended how to properly have the seniority levels in place in order to have a viable, not just set up a team. Anybody can set up a UX team. And people are setting up UX teams, and they're doing it by the seat of their pants. In order to have a viable, a trustworthy, a properly represented UX team, you have to have 1 to 2, depending upon the size of the team. You're doing it from scratch, the team's not going to be that big initially. But you need to have, again, based on that size of that team, 1 or 2 true senior practitioners in that operation. People that have at least 10 years. I mean, really have 10 years of operation. I have met people, I've got 9 years. They had 9 minutes, one person I knew about. I've seen people who make claims. I talked to somebody the other day who was hiring for a well-established UX department, and they didn't tell me something I didn't already know. We talk about it on the show. I started seeing this in 2015. They were trying to hire for several UX-oriented roles. And really, now that I think about it, it wasn't just UX roles. This person was hiring across the board for a lot of different roles, but it was happening in UX. It was happening in everything. This is happening at epidemic levels, what I'm about to mention, across the whole hiring landscape. People are lying about their experience. They are lying about their educational credentials. People are creating fake diplomas. They are creating diplomas, putting their name on it. But when they reach out to the school doesn't have any knowledge of that individual. They have no record of that individual. No transcripts exist. People are lying to get roles. And the funny thing is, these people get away with it in some places because people are not going through the proper steps. They don't have the proper background check, resources in place. They don't have people on staff that are actually viable because some of them lied to get into the roles that they have. So they can't validate who these people are through whatever the means they use to validate who somebody is because they don't really care. And some of them, frankly, they don't have proper resources in place because they don't want to get checked because they bypassed it. They fooled the system. And they got away with it. So they don't want anything to be viable. And speaking about that, here's one of the other funny things about ATS systems. ATS systems, they may check for keywords. They may check for certain trends or things like that. But they don't check for viability. They don't check for accuracy. They are not and cannot be used to check for false information. They can't and they don't. So when people lean on ATS systems, that's really a bad proposition because it's not going to find everything that you should be able to find. When you have 1 to 2 true seniors on the team, you have a system in place through those individuals that will help you to catch these people who are falsifying things. I remember when I was a hiring manager at one job and a person put on their resume that they had a certification from Nielsen Norman Group on information architecture. There is no certification from Nielsen Norman Group on information architecture. And I flagged that person. And I was actually considering it. The person that actually got past what I was looking for, what I would have spotted based on that initial pass. So the person, matter of fact, they got past the recruiters. The person's information was passed on to me. I started going through it. And a lot of what I saw initially sounded great. And you know why people do that? Because they look at other people's qualifications and they duplicate what they see in other people's. They copy what they see in other people's resumes. That's why sometimes having X number of connections on LinkedIn, it's really misleading. A lot of times I'm connected to, or I should say, I have almost 30,000 followers if I haven't already reached 30,000 followers. But a lot of those are not quality connections. I should not and cannot make an issue out of the fact that I have 30,000 followers, approximately 30,000 followers on LinkedIn, because a lot of the people that are following me for less than honorable reasons. And they follow me. I mean, I had my portfolio content stolen before. I mentioned this in a previous show, and I was interviewing for a job, and it turned out that the person that stole my content was also interviewing for the same job. And that's how I found out that the people had seen my information before. So these types of things, folks, it's not good. When you have 1 to 2 true seniors, it will help save you money. It will help keep you from hiring posers, retrofits, and upstarts. It will protect the integrity of your UX operation. And the person who did that post on LinkedIn did not mention anything of the sort. I don't know if they overlooked it. I don't know if they know that that's something you need to do. A lot of people post because they're just trying to be heard. They have no real genuine interest in providing something of value. A lot of people who post are doing it from a narcissistic perspective. They just want to be seen. They just want to be seen. They just want to say that X number of people interacted with them. Those are the people who do glory in those numbers, but the numbers are misleading. So you want to be careful about things like that. Topic number 3. This is also something I've mentioned sort of recently, I do believe, but again, mentioning this from a different perspective. And it has to do with the straw man argument. Speaking about people who just want to be heard on social media, a lot of people, they'll respond to a post because they just want to respond. They just want to be involved in some conversation. They don't have anything of note to contribute. They don't have any points that they're making that bring any real value whatsoever. And a lot of people, they just see a word and they respond to a word. They don't even know the context of the post, and they will just respond. And this is a lot of times where the people who love to engage in a straw man argument will come into play. Now, before I even go any further into this, for some of you that are listening, you might not know what a straw man argument is. So 2 quick definitions and statements about a straw man argument and what it is. A straw man argument, it's a fallacious argument. It's full of fallacy. In other words, there's nothing, again, genuine, nothing accurate, nothing relevant to any degree about the argument or the point that these people are trying to make. And a straw man argument is a fallacy-based statement that really distorts. It brings an opposing stance. What somebody said, one resource on the internet stated this. They present an opposing viewpoint. And it's their opposing viewpoint. They're using that opposing viewpoint in order to present an attack or attack what was talked about, the initial point that was presented or some point that was presented. But they present this point and it's not even what anybody was even talking about. They just divert. They just go a completely different direction. And then they start they continue the presentation based on the false premise that they presented. That's the straw man. There's nothing there. A straw man, the metaphor associated with the straw man is like a scarecrow. That's not a real person that's scaring off the crows. It's a man made of straw. And so the crows are flying away because they're afraid, but nobody's really there. So it's a mirage. Straw man arguments are a form of gaslighting. And so when people do that, the source of the straw man argument, it lets you know that person is corrupt. Why would you, number one, bring up something that nobody's talking about? And then why would you go on and on and on as if you're championing a false premise? I had a post the other day where I was saying, and someone was talking about the whole issue of being ghosted after you've applied for a job. And I talked about recently in the 2-week series on unrealistic expectations that some UX professionals have. I talked about people being ghosted after they applied for a job and how that it's unrealistic to expect, listen to me carefully, please. People expect everybody, every company that they apply to give a response. I said it's unrealistic to expect that. Every company. I mean, do you realize how big the world is, folks? Do you realize how many companies there are out there? Do you realize how many companies people are applying to out there? If you think every single solitary company is going to respond, that's an unrealistic expectation. The other thing that I brought up was that I want to make sure that people have a better strategy on how to proceed. Number one, apply for the job. You apply for the job, your application's in, you've done your part. It's out of your hands now unless you get called to come in for an interview. Everything is out of your hands. You can't control anything that anybody else does, nor are you in a position to demand, that's definitely not your call, that people respond to you. Some companies will respond, they'll respond in a professional way. We have seen lately that very few companies do that. A lot of companies, they decide, somebody said, we got to respond to everybody. So they come up with this cookie cutter. That's what we hate, these cookie cutter responses, but the people who demand a response, that's what you're going to get. You're not going to get a quality response, even when you do get a response. Most times there's going to be a boilerplate statement that's not even accurate. It's not even depicting what they actually did in response to your application. Some companies just respond because they want to say that they responded. So they're responding in really a narcissistic way when you really get into the weeds and delve into it a bit there. So companies are not going to respond. Somebody saw my post and they started saying that what I said was not, I referred to it as a sense of entitlement. When you feel you must get a response, they think that I said it's a sense of entitlement, and it is. And if you go and study what the different characteristics of an entitled mindset, what those characteristics are, you'll see that that's an accurate statement. So somebody went on and they wanted to say that it wasn't an entitled mindset, and then they sort of skewed after that. So for them to say that, there was nothing wrong with that. It was the direction that they took after that everything after that, they started saying things I didn't say. They started making up things based on the conversation they're having in their head. And that's a lot of times where people, they don't intend on starting a straw man argument or raising a straw man point, but because you respond to what somebody didn't say instead of what they did say, now it is a straw man. It is a straw man conversation. And this is something that's really bad. It's something that is, it's counterproductive at that point. It's disrespectful. And I notice only certain people tend to do that. And that's not good. So you have the entitlement and ghosting thing that came up. Some companies are going to ghost you, and some companies are so unprofessional in their responses, you're better off being ghosted. You're better off not hearing from them. You don't want anything. I had somebody once who he prided himself. I mentioned this before. Person prided himself on giving a response to every applicant. But his responses were terrible. They were inaccurate. They reeked of that whole narcissistic mindset. It's like, you got a response from an Elon Musk. Somebody like that has so much on their plate. They're not going to digest everybody's application and respond with proper context. Matter of fact, that person responded to my application as if I've been in UX for a year. And so they addressed it in that way. Matter of fact, they asked me, they suggested I do certain things I had already done. And so that wasn't valuable to me. And that qualifies as destructive criticism. Remember, you have constructive criticism and you have destructive criticism. Constructive criticism builds, destructive criticism tears something down, whether it's intentional or not. And what that person said qualified, again, as destructive criticism. So, and it had straw man tendencies associated with it because they were addressing something that wasn't there. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to be that. I had that happen in another instance. I did a talk on information architecture, And a person wrote back to me, said that they liked my talk, somebody I knew. They said that they liked my talk, but they had issues with one of the points that I made, and they kept talking about this point. I don't remember what the point was. I do know it was a straw man argument because the point that they were saying I made, I didn't make. I didn't say it. I said it was something on the line of how I had said that findability is what good information architecture produces. And that person kept going on to say that I had said something completely different. Was not accurate at all. And they kept saying it. Said, that's not what I said. I said this. And the person kept talking as if I wasn't even a part of the conversation. So I said, you know what? That's it. Let's get together for coffee. I want to talk about this. No. First, you have to be accurate in what you said. First, then we go from there. But straw man arguments, folks, there's no conversation in a straw man dialogue. And so we need to know and understand that today. It's really important that we talk about what a person is really, if you're going to have a conversation, a real conversation, let's talk about what's really being discussed. Let's talk about what people are really conversing about. And if not, then move on. But I don't even know what people get out of creating a false premise, having an internal dialogue, and then responding to somebody when you've been talking to yourself for the last 15 minutes. Now you want to talk to me about what you were discussing in your imagination. That's not a conversation. So, and somebody say, well, Darren, why are you even bringing this up today? Because it's rampant. It's happening a lot. You will encounter it in your journey. And when you have that conversation with somebody or try to, and you need to point out the fact, you need to ask, why are you bringing this up when we're not talking about this? You need to redirect that conversation in order for that conversation to have any real merit. I found a fantastic article about that because we're going to encounter it. Everybody knows we're going to encounter somebody with a straw man perspective. And so you redirect it. And if a person doesn't respond to the redirect, then know that respect your time enough to end that conversation because it's not going to go anywhere. Cannot be fruitful. Absolutely cannot be fruitful. The last point that I want to bring up today involves, again, job postings. There are so many times, and I want to start doing this a little more. I want to start calculating it. I look, even when I'm not looking for a job, I look at job postings. I want to know what the trends are. I've mentioned that before in the discipline. And a lot of times you see these job postings everywhere. I talked about this recently too. That somebody said, hey, 300 jobs in UX this week. I'm going to post this so people can look at this. I've done the work for you. Just go and look at the jobs and apply. Number one, again, I say, that's not really doing us a favor in UX today. People need to go through the rigors of finding jobs to apply to. And I'm not saying that you come across a job, you think that somebody you know might be interested in, you send them a link. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about setting up these informal directories. You want to do that, set up a formal directory. But then it becomes a job source that people go to, like a LinkedIn, like a Glassdoor, like Dice, like Indeed. And there's a lot of other ones out there too. UX Jobs is one that specifically focuses on UX jobs. Some of the other places where you can go and find blog postings, there will be job postings there. Go and check those out by all means. But the people that are looking for the jobs, it's critical that those people, because there's a lot of entitlement there, it's critical that these people go through the rigors. It's part of the experience that folks need to have under their belt. But just because you see a job posting that says it's for UX, folks, a lot of these jobs, they simply do not want a real UX person. And you want to be able to spot that as best you can in the job posting or in the application process. How much experience are they looking for? What kinds of skills are they requiring? When you come across a job posting and they're asking you to make sure that you have HTML, to make sure that you have JavaScript, that's not UX. It simply is not UX. And some people would beg to differ. And the people that beg to differ are the same people that just got into UX yesterday. I've never been required to do any programming as a part of an actual UX job. In 29 years, that has not been part of the function. That's something that if you do come across it, it's going to be in a startup. And a startup, if that's what they need you to have as a startup, that means that they got you wearing a whole lot of different hats. That's not you being a generalist, as we talked about earlier. That's you doing multiple jobs. So know that that's what you're getting into if you apply. Make sure you talk about that when you get to the interview stage. If you get to the interview stage, talk about it. There have been a lot of times I've seen HTML, CSS, JavaScript on a job posting. And then I apply for the job, I get the interview, and I go in and I ask them. And a lot of times they will tell you, you know what? That was supposed to be removed from the job description. Shouldn't have been there. You won't be doing any coding in this job. So a lot of times you take literally what you see in a job description as what the job entails. But then when you get in there, you find out that's not the case. So whether it's during the interview, you need to ask about it. When you get in there and you start doing the job, if you talk to people, if you're in the application process, talk to people that work at the company. Ask them if this is legit. Try to find out what you will really be doing. Because a lot of times people say they're hiring for UX and you find out that couldn't be, that is so far away from what they envisioned that person doing. And they just did not engage with the HR department to make sure that the job posting was accurate. That is amazingly high. The volume at which that happens is amazingly high. Please find out what folks want so you have proper expectations going in. That is one of the most critical things that a person needs to do if and when you get an interview for a job. So, folks, that's it. A real quick potpourri session on today. There's a lot of things I repeated this week, but some people, hey, they're listening to the show for the first time. They need to hear this. Some people listened, and some people listen to the show and don't listen all the way through. And so sometimes the redundancy is really perfect because now somebody heard something they need to hear. But that is all the time we have for today, folks. We are going to end it there. So until next week, and we're expecting to have guests next week. I hope that is the case, but we should be having a couple of guests on next week's show to talk about UX at large. Until then, this is Darren Hood, a host of The World of UX, signing off. Happy UXing, everybody.